To the bank officers downtown, Elias Cole was nothing more than a bad investment. A stubborn relic clinging to a garage that was worth more as a vacant lot than a business. To his own son, he was a heartbreaking tragedy. A man refusing to let go of a world that had already moved on without him. The foreclosure notice was already taped to the door. The clock had run out. Logic dictated that Elias should have packed his boxes and walked away. But on the coldest night of the year, when a rusted, dying RV limped into his driveway carrying a stranger who looked like he had nothing left to lose, Elias made a choice that defied all reason. He chose to work. He chose to bleed for a job that wouldn't pay him a dime, ignoring the whispers that he was digging his own grave. What Elias didn't know, as he turned his wrench in the freezing dark, was that he wasn't just fixing an engine. He was unknowingly unlocking a secret that had been hidden in plain sight, a secret that would soon bring the most powerful men in the city to his doorstep. Heads bowed in shame. He thought he was losing everything, but the test had only just begun. The cold in the garage didn't just sit on the skin. It worked its way into the joints, settling deep in the knuckles like old, hardened grease. Elias rubbed his thumb over the head of a socket wrench, the metal biting into his callus. He didn't mind the temperature. To him, the shop always felt alive, breathing through the vents, smelling of transmission fluid, stale coffee, and 50 years of accumulated dust. Outside, the Detroit winter was burying the street in gray slush. The skyscrapers of the new financial district loomed over his small, flat-roofed building like steel giants waiting to crush a bug. But inside, under the hum of the fluorescent tube lights that flickered with a rhythmic buzz, Elias was the master of his domain. He was currently bent over the engine block of a '68 Mustang. It wasn't a paying job. The owner had passed away 3 years ago, leaving the car to rot in a driveway until Elias towed it in. But Elias couldn't stand to see American iron die a slow death. He treated the piston in his hand with the reverence a priest might show a chalice. He wiped a smudge of oil from the cylinder wall, his movements slow, deliberate, and practiced. The heavy steel door at the front of the shop groaned on its hinges, letting in a blast of freezing wind and the sound of city traffic. Elias didn't look up. He knew that footstep. It was too light, too hurried. It was the walk of a man who looked at a watch more than he looked at the world. "Pop, it's freezing in here. Why is the heater off?" "Jason." Elias placed the wrench down on his red tool cart, lining it up perfectly parallel with the others. Only then did he turn. His son stood in the doorway, brushing snowflakes off a wool coat that probably cost more than Elias made in a month. Jason looked out of place, a clean-cut silhouette against the yacht's backdrop of hanging fan belts and stacked tires. "Heater costs money," Elias said, his voice gravelly, shaped by years of inhaling exhaust fumes. "Work keeps you warm." Jason didn't smile. He walked further into the shop, his polished leather shoes avoiding the oil stains on the concrete floor with practiced disdain. He pulled a manila envelope from inside his coat. The paper was crisp, dry, and terrifying. "We need to talk about the offer, Pop. The developers called me again this morning. They're losing patience." Elias turned back to the Mustang. "Hand me that rag." "Did you hear me?" Jason's voice rose, bouncing off the metal walls. He didn't hand over the rag. He slapped the envelope down on the workbench, right next to the disassembled carburetor. "This isn't a debate anymore. The bank isn't waiting. The city isn't waiting. You're 6 months behind, and the property tax is due in 2 weeks. Elias picked up the rag himself. He wiped his hands, the black grease stubborn in the creases of his palms. He looked at the envelope. He didn't need to open it to know what it said. It was a notice of intent, a foreclosure warning, a death sentence printed in standard 12-point font. "I have a job coming in next week," Elias said quietly. "Mrs. Higgins needs her transmission rebuilt. That's $1,000. Jason let out a short, sharp breath, a laugh stripped of all humor. $1,000? Pop, the land alone is worth $2 million. You are sitting on a gold mine, and you're digging for pennies in the dirt. Look around you." Jason gestured widely at the shop. He didn't see the history. He didn't see the spot near the lift where Elias had taught him to change his first tire. He didn't see the corner where Elias's late wife, Martha, used to sit on a stool reading paperback novels while Elias worked late. Jason saw only junk. He saw failure. "It's a graveyard, Pop. Nobody fixes things anymore. They lease, they drive, they trade in. You're trying to keep ghosts alive." Elias felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar ache that had nothing to do with his heart condition and everything to do with irrelevance. He looked at his son, this boy he had raised on honest work and dirty hands, and saw a stranger who spoke the language of liquidation and assets. "It's not a graveyard," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, though it carried the weight of iron. "It's a hospital. People bring me their problems, Jason, and I fix them. I don't throw them away." Jason softened just for a second. The frustration in his eyes gave way to a pity that hurt Elias more than the anger. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't fix this one. The hearing is set. Unless you can come up with $50,000 by the first of the month to clear the arrears and the liens, they're going to take it. And they won't let you keep the tools. They'll take those too." The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the wind rattling the corrugated metal roof, a lonely, hollow sound. Elias looked at his tools, the snap-on wrenches, the torque drivers, the lathe in the corner. They were extensions of his body. Taking them would be like cutting off his fingers. "I'll figure it out," Elias said, turning his back to his son to hide the tremor in his hands. "There's nothing to figure out," Jason snapped, the pity gone, replaced by the panic of a son watching his father drown and refusing to grab the rope. "I'm trying to save you from being homeless, old man. Sign the deal, sell the land, retire." "Go home, Jason," Elias said. He picked up the wrench again. "Pop, go home." Jason stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Finally, he turned and walked out. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off the gray light of the afternoon. Elias stood alone in the dim garage. He looked at the envelope on the bench. He didn't open it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was thin, the leather worn smooth. Inside, he had $42 and a picture of Martha. He looked at the Mustang. It was a beautiful machine, but it wouldn't run. Not yet. It needed time. It needed care. And for the first time in 40 years, Elias realized that time was the one thing he couldn't fix. The silence that Jason left behind was heavier than the noise of the city. Elias stood in the fading light of the afternoon, the foreclosure notice still sitting on the workbench like a loaded gun. He reached out and flipped it over, face down, as if hiding the words would stop them from being true. He was reaching for the chain to pull down the bay door when a sound tore through the quiet street. It wasn't the smooth hum of the sedans that usually passed by, nor the aggressive growl of the trucks. It was a wheezing, desperate mechanical struggle. A massive shape lurched into the lot, blocking the last of the gray daylight. It was an RV, a Winnebago from the 70s that looked like it had been dragged from the bottom of a swamp. The beige paint was peeling in long, sunburned strips, revealing patches of rust that spread like an infection. The front bumper hung at a crooked angle, held in place by baling wire and hope. The engine gave one final, violent shudder, expelling a cloud of black smoke that hung stagnant in the freezing air, and then died. Elias didn't move. He just watched. In his 30 years of running this shop, he knew the smell of a dead vehicle. It smelled like burnt transmission fluid and defeat. The side door of the RV creaked open with a protest of dry metal. A set of metal steps unfolded halfway and then stuck. A man climbed out. He matched the vehicle perfectly. He was old, his spine curved like a question mark. He wore a coat that was 3 sizes too big, the wool matted and stained, and a hat pulled low over ears that were red from the cold. But it was what followed him that caught Elias's eye. A dog, a golden retriever with a muzzle turned white by time, limped slowly down the steps. The animal shivered violently as its paws touched the icy concrete, pressing its body against the old man's leg for warmth. The stranger looked up at the shop sign, then at Elias. His face was a map of deep lines, his eyes watery and pale. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that shook his thin frame. "Shop's closed," Elias said, though he didn't move to lower the door. The habit of turning away work was foreign to him, even now. "She quit on me," the man said. His voice was raspy, carrying a thick accent that spoke of dusty roads and southern heat. "Just quit. I think it's the alternator, or maybe the soul gave out." Elias wiped his hands on his rag. "I can't help you, friend. I'm packing up, for good." "I don't have anywhere else to be," the man said simply. He patted the dog's head with a trembling hand. "We don't have anywhere else." Before Elias could answer, the sharp beep of a car alarm chirped behind him. Jason had returned. He must have forgotten something, or perhaps he had come back to drive the final nail into the coffin of their argument. Jason stepped out of his pristine sedan, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the smoking RV and the disheveled figure standing next to it. He walked over, his shoes crunching on the gravel, stopping a safe distance away as if poverty were contagious. "What is this?" Jason asked, his voice sharp. "Just a traveler," Elias muttered. "Traveler?" Jason scoffed. He looked at the old man. "Look, buddy, you can't park this thing here. This is private property, and it's about to be bank property. You need to call a tow truck." The old man, Saul, though he hadn't offered his name yet, reached into his deep coat pocket. He pulled out a small drawstring pouch and a wristwatch with a cracked face. He held them out, his hand shaking, not from fear, but from the cold biting into his bones. "I don't have a credit card," Saul said, ignoring Jason and looking straight at Elias. "I have $11 in quarters, and this watch, it was my father's. It's gold underneath the grime. It's all I have." Jason laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. "You're kidding, right? Pop, tell him to leave. We are not running a shelter. That thing looks like a biohazard. If it leaks oil on the EPA assessment, it's going to cost us thousands we don't have." Elias looked at the handful of coins. He looked at the watch that wouldn't fetch $10 at a pawn shop. Then he looked at the dog. The animal was looking up at him, its eyes clouded with cataracts, shivering in the biting wind. It was waiting, just waiting for someone to be kind, or for the end to come. Elias felt a heat rise up his neck. It wasn't anger at the old man. It was anger at the world. It was anger at the idea that value was only determined by what a bank ledger said. "Put your money away," Elias, Orker said. "Pop, don't you dare," Jason warned, stepping forward. "Do not bring that wreck inside. We have the inspection on Monday." You need to be clearing the floor, not filling it with garbage." "It's not garbage," Elias said. He walked past his son, his boots heavy on the pavement. He walked right up to the old man. "What's your name?" "Saul." "Saul, get back in the driver's seat. Put it in neutral." "Pop!" Jason shouted, his composure cracking. "You are literally bankrupt. You are throwing away your last chance for a clean exit." Elias turned on his heel. He pointed a grease-stained finger at his son. "I own this shop until the 1st of the month. That gives me 2 weeks. And in my shop, we don't leave people stranded in the snow." He turned back to the RV. "I said neutral, Saul. Let's get her inside." Jason stood there, mouth slightly open, watching as his father leaned his shoulder against the rusted back bumper of the RV. The old man steered, and Elias pushed. He groaned with the effort, his boots slipping on the slick concrete, every muscle in his 60-year-old back screaming in protest. But the wheels turned. Slowly, painfully, the behemoth rolled into the bay. Under the warm glow of the lights, Jason didn't help. He watched for a moment longer, shook his head in disgust, and got back into his car. He reversed out of the lot without looking back, leaving his father alone with a broken RV, a dying dog, and a job that wouldn't pay a dime. Elias hit the button to lower the bay door. As the metal rattled down, shutting out the winter night, he looked at the RV sitting on his lift. It was ugly. It was a disaster. It was going to take every spare part he had hoarded for 20 years. "Well," Elias whispered to the empty room, "let's see what you're made of." Time in the garage dissolved into a blur of grease, coffee, and the metallic taste of exhaustion. For 2 days, Elias didn't go home. He slept in 20-minute bursts on a cot in the back office, waking up with a gasp whenever his body jerked him back from the edge of sleep. The Winnebago was a catastrophe of neglect. The alternator was seized, the belts were dry-rotted into brittle ribbons, and the wiring harness looked like it had been chewed on by a family of rats. It was the kind of job a sensible mechanic would quote at $3,000 just to make the customer walk away. But Elias worked. He worked with the desperation of a man who knew that stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant facing the silence that awaited him. By the second night, he hit a wall. The RV needed a heavy-duty cooling fan clutch. The parts store was closed, his credit account was frozen, and he had no cash. The engine sat half-assembled, a gaping wound of steel and rubber. Elias stood under the fluorescent lights, wiping sweat from his forehead with a forearm black with oil. He looked around the shop, his eyes landing on the far corner. There, under a canvas tarp that had gathered a thick layer of dust, sat the shape of a 1972 Chevelle. He hadn't uncovered it in 5 years, not since the funeral. Elias walked over, his boots scuffing softly on the concrete. He pulled the tarp back. The cherry-red paint still gleamed, preserved in the darkness. It was Martha's car. They had restored it together, sanding the bodywork on weekends, arguing over the upholstery, laughing when he couldn't get the timing right. It wasn't just a car, it was a time capsule. He needed the fan clutch. It was a direct fit for the RV's big block engine. Elias stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the cold fender. Taking apart from this car felt like vandalism. It felt like theft. But then he looked over at the RV, where the old man, Saul, was asleep in the passenger seat, wrapped in 3 blankets, with the dog curled tightly against his chest. Elias gritted his teeth. "Forgive me, Marty," he whispered. He popped the hood of the Chevelle. The ratchet clicked, a sharp, lonely sound in the quiet shop, as he unbolted the part. It came loose with a heavy thud. He walked back to the RV, carrying a piece of his history to save a stranger's future. By mid-morning of the third day, the work was done. Elias turned the key in the ignition. The RV's engine cranked sluggishly once, twice, and then roared to life. It wasn't a pretty sound. It chugged and wheezed, but it held. The idle smoothed out as the oil circulated. Saul stood by the open-bayed door, the dog leaning against his leg. The old man looked better, though his eyes were still rimmed with red. He listened to the engine like it was a symphony. "You did it," Saul said softly. "I didn't think it could be done." "She's ugly, but she'll run," Elias said, wiping his hands. He felt lightheaded, the lack of sleep making the world tilt slightly. "Keep it under 55. Check the oil every fill-up." Saul nodded. He reached for Elias's hand and shook it. His grip was surprisingly firm, the skin rough like dry parchment. "I won't forget this. You gave us more than an engine." Elias just nodded, too tired for speeches. He watched as Saul climbed into the driver's seat. The RV lumbered out of the bay, merging slowly into the slushy street traffic. A dinosaur disappearing into the modern world. Elias hit the button to close the bay door. As the heavy metal sheet slammed down, sealing the shop, the silence returned. But it felt different now. It felt final. He walked over to the workbench to clean his tools. He reached for a wrench, and then, click. The shop plunged into absolute darkness. The hum of the overhead lights died instantly. The compressor in the corner let out a final hiss and fell silent. The only light came from the gray winter sun, filtering through the high, dirty windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Elias stood frozen in the dark. He flipped the light switch. Nothing. He knew what it was. The electric bill. Another warning ignored. Another deadline missed. The sudden quiet was deafening. Without the hum of the machinery, the shop felt dead. It was just a cold room full of metal. Elias felt his knees give way. He sat down heavily on an overturned bucket, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. The front door opened. A silhouette appeared against the gray light of the street. I saw the lights go out from down the block. Jason's voice drifted in, devoid of anger now. It was flat, resigned. Jason walked in, leaving the door open. The cold wind rushed in, but Elias didn't shiver. He was past feeling cold. "They cut the power, Pop," Jason said, stepping over a coil of air hose. He didn't mock him. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just looked at his father, sitting in the gloom. "That's it. It's over. You can't work in the dark." Elias stared at his hands. In the dim light, he couldn't see the grease anymore. They just looked like shadows. "I fixed it," Elias whispered. "Fixed what?" Jason asked, looking around at the empty bay where the RV had been. "The heap? Great. You fixed a junker for free and now you can't even turn on the coffee pot." Jason sighed, a long exhale that signaled the end of his fight. "I'm going to call the bank. I'm going to tell them we'll sign the voluntary surrender on Monday. Maybe if we cooperate, they'll let you keep the personal tools." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. The fight had drained out of him along with the electricity. "I'll bring you some dinner later," Jason said, his voice softer, almost gentle, the way one speaks to a child who has finally stopped throwing a tantrum. "Don't stay here in the cold, Dad." Jason left. The door clicked shut. Elias remained on the bucket. He reached into his lunch pail and pulled out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. It was stale. He took a bite, chewing slowly, the bread dry in his mouth. He sat alone in the center of his life's work, surrounded by the silent tools, the cold concrete, and the crushing weight of a darkness that had nothing to do with the lights being out. This was the bottom. The silent engine of his life had finally stalled. The following Monday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The air inside the garage was stagnant, holding the chill of the weekend like a trapped breath. Without the heaters humming or the compressor thumping, the building felt hollow, stripped of its mechanical soul. Elias stood by the workbench, his hand resting on the cold surface where the foreclosure notice had sat for weeks. Today, that notice was replaced by a stack of legal binders brought by two men in charcoal suits who stood near the door, checking their phones with impatient, rhythmic taps. Mr. Henderson, the lead attorney for the bank, didn't look at the cars or the tools. He looked at the structure. He looked at the square footage. He saw a demolition site, not a workshop. "Mr. Cole," Henderson said, his voice clipped and dry. "We need to expedite this. The demolition crew is scheduled for a preliminary site walk at noon. We need the keys and the signature on the voluntary surrender deed." Jason stood between the lawyers and his father. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. He held a pen out to Elias. "Pop," Jason said, his voice cracking slightly. "Please, don't make them call the sheriff to escort you out. Just sign it. It clears the remaining debt. It's a clean slate." Elias looked at the pen. A clean slate. That's what they called it when they erased a man's existence. He looked at the empty bay where the Chevelle used to sit. Hidden under the tarp, now just a memory of parts scavenged to save a stranger. He looked at his hands. They were clean, scrubbed raw. He hadn't touched a tool in 3 days. "I'm ready," Elias whispered. The fight had left him. There was no dignity in dragging this out, in being physically removed from the floor he had poured himself. He reached for the pen. His fingers brushed against the plastic barrel. Then, the floor vibrated. It wasn't the heavy, clanking shudder of the construction equipment parked down the street. It was a low, resonant thrum, a purr that started in the soles of their feet and climbed up into their chests. It grew louder, a symphony of combustion, of high-octane fuel and perfectly tuned exhaust notes. Henderson looked up from his file. "What is that? Did the foreman bring the heavy loaders early?" Elias froze. He knew that sound. That wasn't diesel and hydraulics. That was a sound from a different era. The roar swelled, echoing off the brick buildings of the narrow street, drowning out the distant city traffic. Tires crunched over the gravel of the lot. Not one car, but a procession. Through the dirty front window, a flash of sunlight caught chrome. Then came the color. A 1967 Shelby Cobra, painted a deep, midnight blue, rolled into the lot, its engine idling with a menacing growl. Behind it, a Jaguar E-Type, silver as a bullet. Then, a vintage Aston Martin. One by one, they filed in, a parade of automotive royalty lining up on the cracked pavement of Elias's humble shop. These weren't just cars. They were museum pieces, machines worth more than the entire city block. The final vehicle to pull in was a long black vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom. It glided to a stop right in front of the bay door, blocking the view of the street completely. The garage fell silent, save for the collective ticking of cooling metal from the engines outside. "Who acts like this?" Jason muttered, stepping back, confused. "Is this some kind of car club?" The rear door of the Phantom opened. A young man in a sharp suit stepped out, but he didn't look like the bankers inside. He moved with deference. He held the door open, waiting. And then, a boot hit the gravel. It was a polished leather boot, not the torn sneaker Elias had seen days ago. But the way the man moved, slow, deliberate, favoring his left hip, was unmistakable. Saul stepped out. The transformation was absolute. The matted beard was trimmed into a distinguished silver grandeur. The oversized, filthy coat was gone, replaced by a driving jacket of soft, brown leather that looked like it had been tailored in Milan. He wore a scarf loosely around his neck and vintage driving gloves. He didn't look like a homeless wanderer. He looked like an emperor returning from exile. Saul didn't look at the cars. He didn't look at Jason or the stunned lawyers. He walked straight toward the open service door, his cane tapping rhythmically on the concrete. "You can't be in here," Henderson blurted out, stepping forward, his authority suddenly fragile against the presence of the man entering the room. "This is a foreclosure proceeding. The property is restricted." Saul stopped. He slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing those same piercing, intelligent eyes that had watched Elias work for 3 days straight. He looked at Henderson with the kind of dismissal one reserves for a buzzing fly. "Restricted?" Saul's voice was stronger now, the rasp gone, replaced by a baritone command. "I suggest you check your updated ledger, counselor." Saul turned his gaze to Elias. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Hello, Elias. I see you haven't fixed the heater yet." Elias stood rooted to the spot, the pen still hovering near the paper. "Saul, you're... I'm a man who pays his debts," Saul said. He gestured to the assistant behind him, who placed a heavy, leather-bound briefcase on the workbench, right on top of the surrender deed. "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. He was staring at the Rolls-Royce, then back at the man he had tried to kick out into the snow. Saul ignored him. He walked over to the lift, running a gloved hand over the cold steel. "My name is Saul Vance, and I believe you have some paperwork that belongs to me." The lawyer, Henderson, dropped his binder. The color drained from his face so fast it looked painful. "Vance? As in Vance Automotive History? The chairman of the Concours d'Elegance?" "The same," Saul said, turning back to face them. "And I believe I just bought the mortgage note on this building about..." He checked a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, the one that wasn't broken. 20 minutes ago. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. The balance of power hadn't just shifted. It had evaporated and reformed entirely around the old man standing in the center of the grease-stained floor. Elias leaned against the workbench, his legs suddenly feeling like water. He wasn't looking at Saul's expensive jacket. He was looking at Saul's hands. They were the same hands that had held the flashlight for him in the middle of the night. "Why?" Elias asked, his voice rough. Saul walked closer, stepping into Elias's personal space. He lowered his voice, so only the mechanic could hear. "Because 50 other shops saw a piece of junk," Saul whispered, his eyes intense. "You saw the potential. You didn't fix an engine, Elias. You healed a memory." Saul turned back to the room, his voice booming. "Gentlemen," he said to the lawyers, "you may leave. This building is no longer under distressed asset management. It is now the private restoration wing of the Vance collection." He looked at Jason, whose mouth was hanging slightly open. "And you," Saul said, his tone cooling. "You should probably step outside. I think your father and I have business to discuss. Real business." The heavy door clicked shut behind the lawyers, severing the connection to the legal world outside. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the sudden, vertigo-inducing shift of reality. Jason remained standing near the entrance. He looked like a man who had walked onto a stage only to realize he was in the wrong play. He stared at Saul Vance, a legend he had read about in business journals, standing comfortably amidst the oil stains and scattered tools. "You can't be serious," Jason said, his voice trembling not with anger, but with confusion. "You bought the note? For that?" He gestured vaguely toward the empty bay where the RV had been. That thing was a wreck. It was garbage. Saul walked over to the workbench. He picked up a rag, inspecting the grease on it with a strange fondness. "That wreck," Saul said, his voice low and steady, "was my first office. It was my first home. When I started my logistics company 40 years ago, I didn't have a garage. I had that Winnebago and a road map. I drove it until the wheels fell off, and then I drove it some more." He turned to look at Jason. The billionaire's gaze was heavy, carrying the weight of decades of hard decisions. "I took that RV to 5 high-end shops in the city last week. I offered them double their hourly rate. Do you know what they told me? They told me it wasn't worth the bay space. They told me to scrap it. They saw liability." Saul pointed a gloved finger at Elias. "Your father saw a patient." Elias stood by the tool chest, his arms crossed, trying to stop them from shaking. He felt exposed, as if Saul was reading the history written in his scars. "I didn't do it for you," Elias said quietly. "I did it because the dog looked cold." Saul smiled. It was a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I know. And that is why we are here." Saul walked over to the corner of the shop, toward the covered shape of the Chevelle. Jason watched him, paralyzed. Elias stiffened. "I checked the work you did, Elias," Saul said, resting his hand on the tarp. "The fan clutch you installed. It wasn't new, it was vintage. OEM, the kind of part you can't buy at a chain store anymore." Saul pulled the tarp back. The cherry-red paint of the Chevelle gleamed in the dim light. But the engine bay was open, revealing the missing component. The gap where the fan clutch used to be was a dark, empty space in the heart of the machine. "You cannibalized your own car," Saul said, the awe evident in his voice. "You took a piece of your own heart to fix a stranger's junk, knowing you would never get paid, knowing you were about to lose everything." He turned back to Jason. "That is the difference between a mechanic and a craftsman's son. A mechanic changes parts for money. A craftsman gives a piece of himself to make things whole again. You think this land is valuable because of the zoning? This land is valuable because of the man standing on it." Jason looked at the Chevelle. He remembered helping his mother wax that hood when he was 10 years old. He remembered how his father had refused to sell it, even when things got tight. And now he saw the empty space in the engine block. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His father hadn't just been stubborn. He had been sacrificing pieces of his soul, day by day, to keep the lights on, to keep the code he lived by. Jason slumped against the doorframe. The arrogance that had held him upright for weeks finally crumbled. He looked at his father, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He saw the gray in Elias's beard, the permanent stoop in his shoulders, and the quiet dignity that no bank account could measure. "I didn't know," Jason whispered. "You forgot," Saul corrected him gently. "But you can remember." Saul reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black business card holder. He extracted a card and placed it on the workbench next to the old greasy wrench Elias had been holding earlier. "The Vance collection acquires about 20 vintage vehicles a year," Saul said, addressing Elias. "They are tired, broken, and forgotten. I don't trust them to dealerships. I don't trust them to technicians who plug in computers. I need hands that understand the language of metal." Elias looked at the card. It was heavy, embossed with gold. "I want this shop to be the exclusive restoration center for my private fleet," Saul continued. "I pay for the upgrades. I pay for the staff. You run the floor. You decide what gets fixed and how. No deadlines, no invoices. Just the work." Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't know if I have the energy left, Mr. Vance." "You have the energy," Saul said firmly. "You were just using it to fight a war you couldn't win. Now, the war is over. It's time to build." Saul buttoned his jacket. He signaled to his assistant, who was waiting by the door. "The title deed will be transferred to your name by 5 o'clock today. Free and clear." Saul walked to the door, stopping as he passed Jason. He paused, looking at the young man's defeated posture. He didn't offer judgment. He offered a lifeline. "He's going to need a manager, Jason," Saul said softly. "Someone who understands the numbers, but respects the craft. Someone who knows the history of this place." Saul stepped out into the cold winter air, the heavy door closing behind him with a final, solid thud. The silence returned to the garage, but the heavy, suffocating pressure was gone. The air felt lighter. The smell of grease and oil wasn't the smell of poverty anymore. It was the smell of potential. Elias looked at his son. Jason looked at the floor, tears silently tracking through the dust on his face. "Pop," Jason choked out. "I'm sorry." Elias didn't say a word. He walked over, his boots scuffing the concrete, and pulled his son into a hug. It was a hard, crushing embrace, smelling of sweat and iron, the only way Elias knew how to love. "Grab a wrench," Elias whispered roughly. "We have to put the Chevelle back together." 6 months later, the gray slush of the Detroit winter had finally retreated, replaced by the humid golden haze of early summer. The light that poured through the windows of the garage wasn't bleak anymore. It was warm, catching the dancing dust motes that swirled in the air like microscopic stars. The sign above the door had been repainted. It didn't have flashing LED lights or a modern logo. It simply read, "Cole and Son, Restoration and Preservation." Inside, the silence that had once haunted Elias was gone, replaced by a symphony of industry. It was a purposeful noise, the rhythmic ratchet of a socket wrench, the hiss of a pneumatic line, and the low, contented murmur of men who loved their work. In the center bay, a 1955 Mercedes Gullwing sat on the lift, its silver body gleaming under the upgraded lighting. But Elias wasn't working on the $1 million car. He had assigned that to the 2 master technicians Saul had flown in from Germany. Elias was in the back corner, leaning over the fender of a beat-up Ford pickup truck belonging to the local baker. Beside him stood a teenager from the neighborhood, a kid with baggy clothes and eyes that usually looked at the ground, but were now glued to Elias's hands. "Don't force it," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "Metal has a memory, son. If you force the bolt, it fights back. You have to ask it nicely." The boy bit his lip, easing his grip on the wrench, feeling for the thread. When the bolt turned smooth and true, a grin broke across the kid's face, bright and genuine. Elias patted him on the shoulder, a heavy, grounding touch. It was the same way he used to touch Jason 30 years ago. In the front office, the phone rang. Jason picked it up. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms that were starting to show the faint, permanent stains of oil, the tattoo of the trade. "I understand you're in a hurry, Mr. Sterling," Jason said into the receiver, his tone polite but immovable. "But we don't do quick patches. If you want it done by Tuesday, there's a dealership on 5th Avenue. If you want it done right, we have an opening in October." He listened for a moment, then smiled. October it is. We'll see you. Then, Jason hung up the phone. He looked through the glass partition at his father. The anxiety that used to vibrate off Jason like heat from a radiator was gone. He no longer looked at the shop as a liability on a spreadsheet. He saw it as a vault. Every car was a story, and they were the editors. Jason walked out onto the shop floor, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He walked past the rows of gleaming vintage Ferraris and Jaguars that belonged to the Vance collection, heading straight for the back corner. He handed a mug to his father. "Saul called," Jason said. "He wants to know if the Chevelle is ready for the showcase next week." Elias took the coffee. He looked at the 1972 Chevelle, now sitting proudly in the third bay. The engine was whole again. The fan clutch had been replaced, the timing set to perfection. It didn't look like a museum piece that was afraid of the road. Looked like a beast waiting to be let off the chain. "She's ready," Elias said. "But I'm driving her there. No flatbeds." Jason laughed. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The 2 men stood side by side, leaning against the workbench. The shop hummed around them, a living, breathing thing. "You know," Jason said softly, looking at the young kid who was now carefully wiping down his tools. "I used to think this place was just a pile of rust. I thought you were holding on to the past because you were scared of the future." Elias blew the steam off his coffee. "And now?" "Now I know," Jason said. "You weren't holding on to the past, Pop. You were keeping it safe until the rest of us were smart enough to value it again." Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked out the open bay door, where the summer sun was hitting the pavement. He thought about the cold nights, the hunger, the foreclosure notice, and the old man in the broken RV who had tested the weight of his soul. He realized that the loudest things in the world were usually the emptiest. The politicians, the advertisements, the desperate demands for money. They all screamed for attention. But the things that mattered, loyalty, pride, the love for a piece of machinery built by human hands, they didn't make a sound. They just worked. They endured. Elias took a sip of his coffee and looked at his son, then at the shop he had saved from the darkness. "The engine doesn't need to scream, Jason," Elias said, his voice settling into the quiet rhythm of the room. "It just needs to run." And as the work continued around them, the silent engine of the garage beat on, strong and steady, powering a legacy that money could never buy. Elias proved that just because something is broken doesn't mean it's finished. In a world that loves to throw things away and buy new ones, he reminded us that some things are worth the work. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What is one thing, or perhaps one person, that you refuse to give up on, even when everyone else told you to let go? I read every single story you share, and I can't wait to read yours. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe and join our community. We have many more stories coming about the quiet heroes of this world, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Until then, remember, never underestimate the value of a pair of working hands and a kind heart. See you in the next video.